Welcome to our historical research podcast on the history of Russian espionage from the Cold War era up until the present day. In this podcast, we will present the various efforts of our combined research to give an overview of the representation of Russian espionage in the past and present, as well as its threat that it poses to the West. Let's start off with a broad question. From your gathered research, would you say that the Cold War ever really ended?
Well, Jess, historians such as Evan Maudsley have suggested that the Cold War was a product of the 1917 revolution and the Second World War. The Cold War was not simply a product, it is far more complex than this. It was a war of ideology, it was the West versus the East, it was capitalism versus communism, it was the United States versus Russia. Some academics believe that the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, abruptly and finally containing the communist spheres of influence. The Cold War cannot necessarily be defined. It was a conflict of complex, dynamic ideas, none of which can be sourced and verified due to the spread of misinformation. This era can also be characterized by the increased use of espionage between the US and Soviet Union, creating a climate of mistrust and paranoia which would outlive the Cold War. The release of the Venona files in 1995, figures like Elizabeth Bentley, Alger Hiss, and the Rosenbergs, exposed to have supplied the Soviets with covert information, largely regarding military information and even nuclear secrets, which inevitably led to the successful detonation of a Soviet atomic bomb in 1949. The detonation was generally agreed by historians to have occurred earlier than would have been possible with that information. Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, argues that the final ideological alternative to liberalism, communism, had been defeated and thus liberal democracy had triumphed. He placed emphasis on the world heading in a largely capitalist and liberal direction, paving a way for him to lay his claims that history would soon come to an end. Despite Fukuyama's interesting and bold claims, which received huge media and academic attention upon its publication, it is contentious to say that history had ended in 1989. There is extensive and wide evidence for the argument that the Cold War had, and perhaps still has not, ended. Historians have labelled the 20th century as the golden era of Soviet espionage, but who's to say whether this era had an end date or ensues still today? Robert Hansen and Aldrich Ames are two examples of spies who have presented a real threat to American society. They were both respectively former FBI and CIA officers who defected from their home country to provide magnitudes of classified information to the KGB. Hansen specifically stretched his espionage activity from 1979 until 2001, when he was arrested. The nature of espionage activity has certainly shifted from ideological motive to personal gain, espionage activity stemming more from financial incentive than beliefs. Although there has been a marked decrease in US-Soviet espionage activity since the Cold War, relations between the West and the East remain unsteady. Russia's advertising invasion of Facebook during the US elections in 2016 represents a new era of Cold War espionage activity in technology.
Then how does this then fit into the broader debate about the impact of Soviet espionage in the Cold War?
It's a great question, Jess. I think the framing of this debate between a Cold War vision of Soviet espionage versus a more contemporary view of the Russian state's activity is well illustrated by the historian Ellen Schrecker of Yeshiva University, one of the foremost scholars of American anti-communism. Schrecker's basic premise is completely rational. She argues that McCarthyism did more damage to the American Constitution than the American Communist Party, or even Soviet espionage and subversion for that matter, ever did. Representing a more orthodox view of American foreign policy, you've got scholars like John Haynes, who argue the bitter opposite, that people like Schrecker are in denial, that while McCarthyism went too far, it ultimately pursued a very real and present threat to American society, and even recently, Haynes has been sounding alarm bells about the risk of Russian spying in the present.
So then how have Russian spies been presented in news publications in the mid-20th century compared to today?
I would say the first thing that needs to be recognised is that the news media landscape is vastly different now than it was when we think of the iconic mid-20th century spy cases. The age of mass information has made misinformation a much more problematic phenomenon. When you consider the extent of the repression that existed in the United States during the era of McCarthyism and what historians term the Second Red Scare, a period spanning from sort of the late 1940s to the late 1950s, the rhetoric is obviously toned down today compared to the hysteria of that time. Obviously, we're talking about a different level of threat, the height of the Cold War versus a more general geopolitical tension, although one that undoubtedly has its roots in the former.
So how is this then translated into portraits of Russian spies in the news media?
So, as was the case during the Red Scare of the 1940s and the 1950s, the issue of Russian spying has again been propelled to the forefront of Western media. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was the sighting of the so-called Russian spy whale off the coast of northern Norway, which had a Property of St. Petersburg tag on its body. That this was treated as almost a high-profile news story illustrates the real panic in the West about Russian infiltration. I think in a portion of our country's news media, there is even, I think it's fair to say, a level of hysteria, at least somewhat reminiscent of the worst excesses of the Red Scare in the United States. A recent Sun headline from the end of 2018 read, "Vladimir Putin has up to 75,000 Russian spies in Britain, shock report reveals." The article itself claims that half of Russian expats inside the UK are feared to be assets of the Kremlin. The article itself gave no evidence for this whatsoever. The report itself is not even accessible. But I think this goes to show how far things have started to come full circle in some respects. On the other side of the Atlantic, the New York Post raised similar queries several years ago, writing that there are more Russian spies in the United States today than at the height of the Cold War. The article does distinguish, though, between the low-key methodology of Russian sleeper agents today versus the high-profile spycraft of Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg during the Second World War. But again, the need for comparison must surely signify that causal links are being drawn between then and now. Now, if we'd like to go back in time, there are clear parallels between right-wing outlets in their coverage of Russian spying. The American Legion magazine made light of the deceased Rosenbergs' screams for justice as they were executed in Sing Sing prison in 1953 on charges of stealing secrets in the American nuclear project. The article decried the Rosenbergs as traitors, Reds, and commies, and more broadly, the campaign to grant the Rosenbergs clemency was considered proof that a larger network of Russian conspiracy was at play to undermine the fabric of American society. Every mainstream newspaper from the New York Times to the Washington Post justified the execution of the Rosenbergs. Newspapers at the time popularized Judge Irving Kaufman's diatribe against them, that the crime they had committed was worse than murder, for it gave the Soviets the potential to commit nuclear atrocities against the free world. More recently, specifically in reference to the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, newspapers like the New York Times have led the charge in investigating the link between the two men charged by Britain as GRU operatives, particularly in its praise for British efforts to successfully track down the perpetrators. Efforts in journalism have been spearheaded towards naming and divulging precise information about the Salisbury perpetrators, Alexander Mishkin and Anatoly Chapiga. Since then, we have seen efforts, particularly in British media, to try and form a portrait of the perpetrators, without much avail. Clearly, the importance of understanding spies on a more personal level still prevails from profiles of Cold War spies such as Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs.
So then what are the ways in which spying between Russia and the West have been portrayed in culture mediums such as films, TV shows and books?
Well, during the second half of the 20th century, matters relating to the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union became an important part of popular culture and as such were portrayed in books, TV shows and films. On both sides of this conflict, there was keen public interest in spying and espionage. When it comes to books, TV and films, it is worth noting that while everything produced in Cold War America was officially independent of the state, they mostly followed the pro-Western line, or else they would not have been produced and promoted by mainstream companies. Moreover, everything produced in the Soviet Union was endorsed and orchestrated by the state, and therefore served as propaganda. The West experienced the rise of popular spy novels and films, which presented the issue in both a serious and a light-hearted campy manner. The James Bond book series by Ian Fleming, as well as its film series adaptation, presented its titular British spy character as a patriotic, suave, womanizing action star. The film series in particular, which has become a cultural staple of blockbuster cinema, portrays spying in a light-hearted and campy way, especially in the films released during the 1960s and the 1970s. Soviet spies in Bond films such as From Russia with Love in 1963 and The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977 are presented as villainous Russians, although in both films the Soviet Union is often presented as a pawn of the main villain. This is because the James Bond books and films focus more on fictional stories and characters and use the backdrop of the Cold War. However, more serious books and films have been made about the Cold War, such as a 1959 novel by Richard Condon entitled The Manchurian Candidate, as well as his 1962 adaptation, which was released during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The story follows a US veteran who's become an unwitting sleeper agent for the Soviet Union after being brainwashed. This plot was inspired by fears of Soviet infiltration in America through dark and clandestine means. There was a remake of The Manchurian Candidate, which was set not in the Cold War, but in the year of its release, 2004. This remake kept the same premise, of the main character being a sleeper agent, but replaced the Soviet Union with evil corporations as the villains. And while there are not many modern spy films which really delve into the contemporary relationship and tensions between Russia and the West, there are many that still focus on the Cold War, such as the British film Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which was released in 2011, and the American film Bridge of Spies, which was released in 2015. The latter, directed by Steven Spielberg, focuses on a prisoner exchange between the US and the Soviet Union. As opposed to being presented in a villainous light, the Soviet intelligence officer in the film is somewhat sympathetic. This demonstrates how espionage within the Cold War is being portrayed retrospectively in a more complex and nuanced manner.
And do we have a picture from the other side within the Soviet Union?
Well, the spy genre was of course an obsession on both sides of the Cold War. In 1968, the Soviet Union released its first film about the KGB, titled The Dead Season. Instead of being an action film like James Bond or a thriller like The Manchurian Candidate, it was more of an intelligent drama that treated Soviet spies in a more down-to-earth way, especially in comparison with American films at the time. A famous Soviet book titled 17 Moments of Spring by Yulian Semyonov, as well as its 12-part TV adaptation released in 1973, were hugely popular in the Soviet Union. Its iconic main character, the Soviet spy Stielers, can be seen as a Russian Bond with regards to his popularity in the Soviet Union. Like Bond, Stielers is presented as an intelligent and patriotic spy. Unlike Bond, however, there is less of a focus on action and gadgets and so on. This is yet another example of a Soviet film in which Soviet spies are presented in a more grounded way than in Western films.
Moving on from this, is Russian infiltration of Western news media, such as fake news and the general manipulation of political campaigns, a threat to the West?
Yes, manipulation of the media through the means of disinformation, such as fake news, is a significant threat to the West because Russian misinformation campaigns undermine democracy. The media today, mostly the internet in the 21st century, is the way people find out the state of the world around them. The media influences the principles and beliefs, political beliefs, of the average person because it structures an individual's perspective on what the world is like around them and how they fit into it. A sense of a person's place in the world and a perception of the state of the world will significantly influence their political perspective, which is why, in a democracy, the integrity of the media is essential, because a society must correctly inform the voting public so that the public can make an informed decision on who to vote into power. If the information people receive in a Western democracy is supplied or influenced by a foreign power, with information that favours that foreign power's agenda, such as Russia, democracies will be influenced into electing individuals into power who would serve to benefit the foreign power. Craig Silverman coined the term filter bubble. He describes this as a situation in which an internet user only encounters information or online opinions that reinforce their own beliefs, caused by algorithms that are designed to personalize a user's experience based on the user's viewing history. This has also been referred to as, this can cause what some refer to as confirmation bias and tunnel vision, where people online only see content that reinforces their own prejudices and beliefs. The internet has arguably been a good thing because it has allowed the average citizen a much wider access to information from a wider range of sources. The only issue is these sources aren't all credible because they aren't all fact-checked. Jeffrey Gottfried and Elisa Shearer state that 62% of US adults get their news from social media. Legitimate information has been argued to be as easily accessible, in fact, sometimes more accessible than illegitimate information. On Facebook, for example, the most popular fake news stories were more widely shared than the most popular mainstream stories. A study by Ipsos Public Affairs for BuzzFeed News found that 75% of Americans believed fake news stories. This study was carried out between November and December 2016, carried out on 3,015 participants in the US.
You say there's an issue of social media users only viewing content that reinforces their own beliefs, but whenever I use social media, I think I generally see a good variation in political content.
Well, I don't want to overstate the issue of filter bubbles. I'm not arguing that all of Western society is trapped in their own personal filter bubbles. In fact, recent studies, such as that of Elizabeth Dubois of Ottawa University, shows that a minority of Western populations exist in a filter bubble. In the UK, Elizabeth Dubois studies study looked at how widespread the echo chamber effect is in British society. She based the study on the online consumption habits of 2,000 British people to see how at risk people in British society were of being in an echo chamber. An echo chamber is effectively the same thing as a filter bubble, where people only see content that reinforces their own perspectives. Based on this study, she estimated that 8% of UK society are at risk of being in an echo chamber. Although a minority of Britain exists in these echo chambers, 8% is still a lot of people. In a close election, 8% of the population would be more than enough to sway an election a certain way. Russia has taken advantage of these filter bubbles in the West to encourage polarization in society. They have done this by creating fake social media accounts and adverts online that encourages more extreme political beliefs both on the left and the right. As Hunt Alcott and Matthew Jensko argue, Russians use online fake news accounts because it's cheap, most effective at reaching the masses than physical operations, and it's easy. Russia has been taking advantage of the unregulated and wide availability of social media sites, one of the most notable examples being Facebook. For example, the House Intelligence Committee of the United States investigated fake news during the 2016 US presidential election and found several examples of political adverts and Facebook pages created by Russia to influence polarization in the United States. Russia has also been combating attempts by the West to counter fake news. In the UK, Russia hacked the Institute of Statecraft, a Scottish charity created to combat Russian disinformation in Western news. The website is currently closed pending an investigation by the National Cybersecurity Centre. The BBC reported Western officials believe an organisation linked to the Russian state was behind the hacking. Arguably, the issue of fake news or inaccurate news has been a societal problem in the West that has been taken advantage of by the Russian government. For now, disinformation in online media will not topple over Western democracy. However, with political polarisation already being a serious issue in the West, it is only set to worsen if regulation on political advertisement and political pages on social media websites is not strengthened.
So how has espionage between Russia and the West evolved from the early 20th century to the present day?
Well, throughout the Cold War, the Kremlin used the KGB repeatedly to meddle in US domestic politics. Every major branch of President Roosevelt's administration was penetrated by Soviet intelligence, such as the now infamous KGB agents such as Alger Hiss. Russian espionage maintained its ability to infiltrate US domestic policy throughout the Cold War. The KGB's greatest attempt to meddle in the US presidential elections was against Ronald Reagan, whom the Kremlin regarded as the greatest threat to the USSR. Additionally, espionage has evolved from the early 20th century, as Russian spies were primarily motivated by ideology. This belief led to the US-Soviet spies to attempt to stop the US monopoly on nuclear secrets.
So how has Russian espionage changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has been more involved with its internal situation rather than acquiring US state secrets. So, espionage has evolved between Russia and the West from the early 20th century because Russia's main point of focus has been the Middle East and extremist groups. For example, the FSB, the modern branch of the KGB, has poured resources into fighting jihadists and separatist rebels from Chechnya. This new direction Russian espionage has evolved into shows that their preferred methods of espionage have changed over time since the early Cold War to present day. Assassinations rather than infiltrating government is one of the new directions Russian espionage has taken. In 2002, the assassination of jihadist commander in Chechnya, known as Kitab, was attributed to the FSB. Furthermore, the FSB is integral to Russia's other form of espionage, which is information warfare. This includes shaping public opinion abroad via social media. However, Russia is still linked with the West in this new form of espionage. US officials believe the Russian state was linked to the hacking and disinformation campaign that targeted voters in the 2016 US presidential election. Calder Walton stated 17 US federal intelligence agencies have agreed that Russia was responsible for the presidential election hacking, which involved an unprecedented Russian effort to interfere in the US electoral process. The operation involved hacking Democrats' emails and spreading fake news and pro-Trump messages. Therefore, since the early Cold War, espionage between Russia and the West has evolved into the present day by adapting to new technology. Russia now attempts to infiltrate US domestic policy by trying to shape US public opinion through disinformation campaigns or pro-Russian news. Furthermore, Russia's greater involvement with their own internal situation and how their new forms of espionage can benefit the Russian state's handling of new forms of threats, such as the Chechen rebels.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope that we have illustrated that despite the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, Russian espionage has not only adapted to a new age in terms of practice, but also in terms of a new phase of ideological warfare. If you have not found our podcast through our website, do take a look for any further information about the topic and to see the sources that we have referred to throughout at www.russianspies.org. Thank you.